All right, the British have beaten the French in the French and Indian War, and the colonists are extremely happy, excited. They celebrate with bonfires. You know, it's great to be English, at least at this time. But we have new trouble brewing on the frontier. You know, the French have been pushed out of the Ohio Valley, and the colonists are very eager. You know, they can't wait to get into this territory to start trading with the natives and make a lot of money. But a lot of tribes that are living in the Ohio Valley are not too happy to see the English coming. Remember, they're different. You know, the English are plowing up the land, they're chopping down the forests, and this displeases the natives. The French have been treating the natives very well. They held celebrations for them, gave them presents, treated them very fairly. Well, the English don't do this. You know, they're there to make money. And the English send in Lord Amherst. You remember, he's the guy that had defeated defeated the French at Duquesne. Well, he is sent into the Ohio Valley to put down the resistance. Amherst treats the natives very poorly. You know, he says no more celebrations, no more presents, and by the way, I am increasing the price of these trade goods. You know, you want a new pot, you want a new kettle, you want a new knife, well, you're going to give me more furs. And the natives are like, well, man, that's not fair. You know, the French treated us really well. And I'm sure Amherst says, you know, hey, well, look around. Do you see any French here? This is the British now, and then you're going to play by our rules. So this is not a very good way to start the relations with the Native Americans in the Ohio Valley. So things aren't going very well for the English in the Ohio Valley. And the natives aren't very happy about this. And they go, you know, this is unfair, it's unjust, and it's not going to stand. Well, they have a leader. And the leader is an Ottawa chief named Chief Pontiac. And he leads an uprising, you know, against the English. And he's backed by the French. The French have been supplying weapons and supplies and maybe even some tactical advice. And he leads this uprising against the British, and he attacks Fort Detroit. Okay? He is joined by many other tribes. He's a very dynamic leader, very influential, and he and his followers start to capture many of the British forts in the Ohio Valley. But things are getting ready to turn, because you notice in 1763, and if you remember anything, this is right before the French surrender and sign the Treaty of Paris. The French come to Chief Pontiac and say, hey, listen, bad news. We surrendered, and we're leaving. You know, good luck to you, because we don't like the British either, and, you know, we hope you win, but we're out of here. So without the French ally, without their weapons and supplies, Chief Pontiac's alliance begins to fall apart. A lot of those tribes kind of say, hey, I'd like to help you, but we got to go. So Pontiac's left by himself, and, you know, the whole resistance kind of is futile. But it does one very important thing. It gets the British attention. Pontiac's war convinces the British officials they should stop the colonists from moving into the Ohio Valley. Why? Because if the colonists are allowed to move into the Ohio Valley, the British are going to have to send troops to protect them, which is very expensive. So the British decide to come up with this policy. It's called the Proclamation of 1763. And the British draw a line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and they tell the colonists, you can't go west of this line. Okay, can't do it. And they also say that anybody that's already living there, if you're living there in the Ohio Valley, then you've got to come back. Now, can you imagine the colonists' reaction to this? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Because we just fought the French. We drove them out. We the ones that were suffering and dying on behalf of the British, and now you're not going to allow us, your loyal citizens here in the New World, to move into the Ohio Valley? You got to be kidding me. And the British said, that's exactly right. And to make sure that you don't, we're sending in 10,000 troops to make sure that you don't. Now, honestly, 10,000 troops, even if they were all spread down the Appalachians, it would still have a very difficult time keeping these colonists out of the Ohio Valley. But most of these troops are not in the Appalachians. They are in the cities and the towns. And this kind of angers the colonists because what's it look like? It looks like the British don't trust them. The British are sending troops to make sure that they behave. And to add insult to injury, the colonists have to pay to support the new troops. Quartering Act. Now, many of these colonists say, forget it. I don't care what the king says or Parliament. And they ignore the Proclamation of 1763, and they start heading west through the Cumberland Gap. They set up little towns and villages. Daniel Boone probably being the most famous. Daniel Boone goes through the Cumberland Gap. He explores Kentucky, which is a very sacred hunting ground for many tribes. And he spends about 2 years exploring this territory. He finds it absolutely fantastic, wonderful, great hunting. And he starts to lead colonists through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. Now, Boone was actually captured by the Shawnee, as a matter of fact. And for a while, he acted very happy to be a member of the tribe. He, in fact, gets adopted by the chief. And Boone eventually runs away and actually leads an attack onto the tribe that has adopted him. So that's kind of an ugly situation. You know, the other thing that you really need to remember, though, is this war, the French and Indian War, which is called the 7-Year War in Europe, has almost bankrupted the Great Britain. War is very expensive, and it's cost them a lot of treasure. And they need to raise some income. So what they want to do is basically raise taxes on the colonists. Now, taxes have been raised in Britain. People that are living in England are paying quite a bit of taxes. And they think it's only fair that the colonists should help pay for this. After all, most of this war was fought to drive the French out of the Ohio Valley and to protect the colonists from French and Native Indian attacks. So the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time is a guy named George Grenville. He feels that the colonies should help pay for this because remember he believes in what's called the mercantile system. The mercantile system is the idea that these colonies are there to basically make Great Britain rich. That's the only reason you're there, is to improve the economic conditions of the empire. So the very first tax Grenville orders is called the Sugar Act of 1764. Now Grenville places this tax on molasses. And remember that molasses is one of the key elements of the triangular trade. They're bringing up molasses from the West Indies where they're going to turn that into rum. They're going to take that rum along with guns and weapons and tools over to West Africa and trade that for slaves. So molasses is a key product that's imported into the colonies. Now there actually had always been a tax on molasses, and if you'd paid the actual tax on it, you'd probably gone broke because it was very, very expensive. Most of the colonists ignored it. They bribed officials, and they really never paid it. Okay? Well, the Sugar Act of 1764 actually lowers the tax on molasses. But Grenville has made it clear that the colonists will pay this tax. He has actually made it easier for smugglers to be brought to trial. So that's the first tax. The second tax that Grenville puts on the colonists is the Stamp Act of 1765. The Stamp Act. This is kind of confusing because it sounds like it is a tax on stamps, but it's not actually. Grenville puts new tax on legal documents. So all of these things, wills, marriage documents like licenses and diplomas if you're graduating from college, are going to have a special stamp on it to prove that the tax has been paid. It even goes on to tax newspapers. So if you want to read a newspaper, you're going to have to pay a tax, along with even playing cards and dice. So this is a tax that has never been implemented in the colonies. This tax has actually been paid for quite some time in Great Britain. The English had been paying taxes on these items for quite some time, but they'd never imposed this tax on the colonists, and they are outraged at this. They actually destroy Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's home in Massachusetts. They tear it down. They almost kill him and his family. Now the colonists also begin to throw rocks government officials, and they begin to even tar and feather people. And tarring and feathering, that may not sound that bad until you realize what they're actually doing. They're stripping these poor guys of their clothes, and they're pouring, very hot tar on their bodies, which is probably causing severe burns. They then dump feathers on them. And this is to do two things. First of all, it's going to, it's a form of torture. I mean, these poor guys are probably trying to scrape this tar off their bodies. Maybe their flesh is even coming off with this tar. As it cools, it begins to harden. It's almost impossible to get off. And then it's also to humiliate them. And remember, these are officials of the king. They represent King George III in the colonies. So this is outrageous, and the British are shocked. They're shocked. Britain had paid a great deal to protect the colonies. And in fact, people in England had been paying much higher taxes than the colonies. Than the colonists. And Great Britain probably thinks, my gosh, what is wrong with these people? Are these the bunch of most ungrateful beggars on earth? They cannot believe our reaction to this simple tax. But the real issue, I feel, isn't necessarily the money. It is, and you need to remember this is probably the most important part of the revolution, okay, which leads to the actual shooting, the actual warfare, is no taxation without representation. People in England have representation in Parliament, in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, but there is nobody representing the interests of the colonists in Parliament. They think it's unfair. Now, they claim to be more than willing to pay these taxes as long as, their legislature, their representatives are passing these taxes. So the colonists begin to unite in protest. They call for a delegation. It's actually called the Stamp Act Congress. 9 of the colonies sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress. And they write a letter to the king, a petition, asking the king and Parliament to, get rid of these taxes because they think it is unfair that they cannot be taxed without their consent, without representation. And as you might well imagine, how king and Parliament feels about a bunch of colonists, second-class citizens in their eyes, telling them how to run their empire. So Parliament pays little attention. So what's the option? Parliament is obviously not going to listen to the request. So what can the colonists do to protest this act? Well, the simple thing is they're going to boycott. In other words, they are not going to buy any of this stuff. And it's very effective. Trade fell off by 14% right off the bat. British merchants, they're facing financial calamity. They might be forced to lay off their workers. So they go up to Parliament and say, hey, listen, we agree with you. These colonists need to pay these taxes, but they won't. They're not buying it. And it's costing us money. It's costing us possibly our businesses. So please, repeal, get rid of this tax. So in 1766, Parliament repealed, which means to cancel this tax. However, Parliament does say this. They say that Parliament does indeed have the right to tax the colonies anytime they feel like it. So things begin to return to a little state of normalcy in the colonies, but this is going to be short-lived. Now, in England, they have a new prime minister. His name is Charles Townshend. Grenville, if you remember, who used to be the prime minister, is now a member of Parliament. And he probably doesn't like Townshend. He clashes with him. And, the Great Britain is still in need of money. So Grenville kind of goads him, makes fun of him, mocks him, and says, oh, hey, when I was prime minister, I didn't hesitate to tax the colonists. But it looks like Townshend is a coward, is afraid to tax the colonists. So as you might well imagine, Townshend says, oh yeah, you think I'm a coward? Well, watch this. And he passes the Townshend Act. Parliament in June of 1767 passed the Townshend Act, which places a new tax on glass, on paper, paint, lead, and tea. Now the taxes are low, but again, that's not the point. the colonists still argue that this tax, even though they are low, is still a violation of the idea of representation. No taxation without representation. They said that Parliament does not have the right to tax them without their consent. But the most egregious part of the Townshend Act, I feel, is basically it's a piece of paper. It's an official document that government officials carry with them, and it is known as the Writs of Assistance. Okay? The idea is to stop smuggling. So with this writ of assistance, government officials can come and search private property without even giving a reason. They can just be walking along. Oh, check out that ship over there. I wonder if there's any smuggling going on. Well, they can board that ship and they can search without permission, just for any reason they want to. Now, the colonists, as you might well imagine, are outraged. They claim this is a violation of English rights. You know why? Because it is a violation of English rights. They couldn't do this in England, but they're allowed to do it in the colonies. Once again, Great Britain is treating the colonists as second-class citizens. So, once again, the merchants and the planters unite, and they begin to boycott the items taxed by the Townshend Act. And a new group begins to form, and that is the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. And this is a movement that begins basically in Boston. So during this time frame, you start to see some new colonial leaders come to the forefront. In Massachusetts, you have Sam Adams. Sam Adams is kind of an odd character. He dressed in the same red cheap suit. He wore this cheap gray wig. A lot of people thought he was kind of odd, probably made fun of him. But guess what? He is a great organizer of people. He loves politics. He's always at the town meetings, and he whips the people into a frenzy and really is the founder of the Sons of Liberty. Now, he has a cousin named John Adams. John Adams is a lawyer. He has kind of a prickly personality. Probably not a lot of fun to be around, but you know what he is very good at? He is good at understanding British law. British law. Now, the real fun person in that family was probably Abigail Adams, John's wife. Abigail Adams she's highly intelligent. She wrote lots of letters. Was probably a lot more fun to be around than John Adams. So she becomes a very important person as well. In Virginia, you start to see some leaders emerge. George Washington, and you remember him from the French and Indian War. He's the guy that was leading the troops that fired the first shots in the French and Indian War. He is, he really begins to side with the Patriot cause. The second person is Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is a very powerful speaker. Many of you guys may have heard his very famous speech that says, is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased with the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death. What he's saying there is your precious life so important to you that you would want to live it in slavery under a tyrant, the king in parliament? He says, no way. It's not worth living like that. And his powerful speech inspires a young law student named Thomas Jefferson. So on this slide, you have our first president, George Washington, our second president, John Adams, and our third president, Thomas Jefferson, all emerge during this time of unrest under the Townshend Act. Now, in the colonies, there are really two areas that are the centers of protest in Northeast. Primarily, it's going to be New York and Boston. They are the epicenter of this movement, of this unrest, of this revolutionary ideas against the British Crown. Now, in New York, they're very upset about the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act, which started after the Proclamation of 1763, is this idea that the colonists are going to pay to basically support these troops. They have to provide housing, candles, bedding, and beverages to the soldiers in the colony. And these colonies are going to pay for that. Well, the New York Assembly said, no way, we're not doing that. And so Parliament basically fires them. Said, you guys are gone. You're out of here. So the New York Assembly has been dismissed by Parliament. Well, in Boston, because of all the unrest, the rioting, the tarring and feathering, the destruction of government property, the British government sends 2 regiments of soldiers to protect customs officials. Customs officials are basically tax collectors. Now, these soldiers are in the colonies. They probably don't want to be there either. They've been ordered there. Their families are back in the British Empire probably. And they're often the target of insults and even physical assaults. And to make matters worse, a lot of these British soldiers are underpaid. They, might have families back in Great Britain they're taking care of, and soldiers' pay isn't cutting it. So oftentimes these soldiers will take jobs into the stables or maybe are on the docks, and this is causing a lot of heartache with a certain group of people in Boston, especially young men, teenagers and young men who feel that these British soldiers are taking their jobs. Well, things kind of reach a boiling point in March of 1770. This crowd has begun to gather. There's 8 British soldiers guarding the customs house, and they start yelling at the lobster backs. And they're called lobster backs because they wear red uniforms. And the British wore red uniforms, by the way, if you don't remember this, is because if a British soldier shot, in his chest, this red jacket is going to hide the blood, which is going to cause less panic in the ranks. If you see a guy with blood everywhere, you might panic and, discipline would break down. So the British actually, there's a reason for them wearing these red uniforms to cover up the blood. Well, the colonists end up calling them lobsterbacks, and they're very cruel to these guys. And this crowd has gathered on the night of March the 5th, and they start yelling insults. And then maybe a snowball comes in, and the crowd gets bigger, and the soldiers are being pressed back by this crowd. They're getting, the crowd gets larger and larger, and they're pressing towards these soldiers. And then the snowballs begin to turn into chunks of ice. Obviously, it's probably hard as a rock. And even broken oyster shells, which are very sharp, and they're throwing this stuff at these soldiers. And these soldiers probably feel that at the very least they're going to be beaten up, but in the worst case they might even be killed. And somebody, we don't know who, I don't know who, actually one of these British soldiers fires a shot. And once one person shoots, the rest of the guys shoot into the crowd, and 5 of the colonists are killed, including a young African-American sailor named Crispus Attucks. All right? So this is not good. The British have now shot 5 people in Boston. Here's an image of it, and this is great propaganda. The Sons of Liberty are probably like, oh my God, I can't believe this has happened, but hey, maybe we could use this tragedy to our advantage. So Paul Revere, who is a silversmith in Boston, makes an engraving of this massacre, as they call it. If you think about it, really, who's instigators here? I would have to say it's probably the crowd, the colonists. These guys are there, just minding their own business, and they feel that their life is threatened, and they fire back. But the Sons of Liberty commissioned this artwork. Paul Revere makes it, and this image is sent to newspapers all over the colonies. They don't have TV reporters or iPhones to take pictures with, so this is what the other colonists see. And if you look at this picture, you'll notice that it's the British soldiers, the officers in the back here. He's, telling the soldiers to fire on the crowd. And you see there's women in the crowd. This woman right here, she's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. And people are being murdered. And it looks to other colonists in the other colonies that the British troops are just marching around the streets of Boston, indiscriminately shooting and massacring people, which really is not the whole story. But this is a highly effective piece of propaganda. The interesting thing about the Boston Massacre is this. John Adams, and you remember John Adams, he is the cousin of Sam Adams, the founder of the Sons of Liberty, actually defends these British soldiers. He says that even though the king and parliament are treating us unfairly, we are going to show that in the colonies, in the American colonies, we treat people fairly. And John Adams was actually able to have these guys acquitted of murder. One guy was, probably the guy who fired, was branded on the hand because they were under orders not to fire. But that's the only thing that happened, is these British soldiers were found not guilty of murder and acquitted. And the second president of the United States, John Adams, is the lawyer who defends them. Now, after the Boston Massacre, and again, I told you that they made an image, but they also began to form committees called the Committees of Correspondence. Okay, and these committees' jobs are to write letters to the other colonies, telling them how bad they're being treated by the British in Massachusetts. And within 3 months, there are 80 committees writing letters and pamphlets. And this becomes really a major tool to protest the British in the colonies. What is sad and what is ironic, I should say, is that on the very day of the Boston Massacre, a bill was introduced to Parliament repealing, which means canceling, most of the Townshend Act. And the reason for that is because, once again, the boycott had severely hurt British merchants. When you don't buy their goods, they don't make any money. And they repeal almost all of the taxes, but one tax remains, and that is the tax on tea. On tea. And King George justifies this by saying, there should always be at least one tax that gives us the right to tax. So for a while, calm begins to return to the colonies, but it's going to be short-lived because the question still remains about taxation without representation.